welcome to the inaugural series on the book of education known as Sefer HaChinuch. We will be exploring this most exciting book, a work of the 13th century great Spanish scholar who until this very day remains anonymous, but nevertheless has made an indelible mark on the world of Torah scholarship with regard to the subject of organizing the 613 commandments, known popularly as Taryag Mitzvot, Taf Reish Yud Gimel, the numerical equivalent of 613. In order to understand the concept of 613, Taryag, I must take you back to a first grade experience of mine back in the 1950s. We had a teacher who taught us the Chumash, and we were studying the book of Breshit, the parsha of Vayishlach. And there, the Torah speaks of Yaakov after 20 years in the home of his father-in-law Lavan, returning to the land of Canaan, the promised land, soon to become the land of Israel. The Torah says, Im Lavan Garti. Yaakov declares, I resided in the home of Lavan. The great commentator, Rashi, adds to this phrase of the Torah, Im Lavan Garti, v'taryag mitzvot shamarti. In spite of the fact that I resided in the home of Lavan for so many years, and Lavan was far from being a righteous person, nevertheless, taryag mitzvot shamarti, I remained true to the words of the 613 commandments. Yaakov, our forefather Jacob, actually feared that in the home of Lavan, the influences would be so negative that perhaps after so many years, he would have fallen out of line. But not so. After 20 years, Yaakov returns home with a declaration, in spite of it all, Taryag mitzvot shamarti, I observed all the 613 commandments. Now, as first graders, we were very, very well accepting the words of the teacher that 613 is the number of commandments that were given over to the nation of Israel. And for sure, the forefathers had some idea about what those commandments were all about. And no one questioned the fact that how could the forefathers observe these commandments prior to the history of the giving of the Torah. Those are not the concerns of a first grader. Im Lavan Garti, v'taryag mitzvot shamarti. However, when considering the entire issue as mature adults, how do we view this idea that Rashi tells us that Yaakov, our forefather Jacob, observed all the 613 commandments? Well, here we must introduce the idea that Rashi, on most occasions, is quoting from the Midrashic literature. Studying Midrash requires each and every time to ask the fundamental question, does this section of Midrash come to supplement the biblical text? Which means that the Torah gives us a narrative, a story, but leaves us somehow hanging with some missing information. And through the channels of the oral law, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the Midrash fills in those missing gaps. So you may have a biblical story that goes up to a certain point, and now the Midrash just takes over. And that section that we are studying in the Midrash is to be regarded as pure history. On the other hand, there are no small number of sections of Midrash that seem to be history, but they're not history at all. They are our sages' way of conveying very deep religious, spiritual, and philosophical messages. What they've done is they've dressed up certain ideas in halachic garb, in the language that the people who delve with halakha all the time are fluent with. And hence it gives us a vehicle and a medium of how we can understand these deep philosophical ideas. And hence, perhaps when Rashi, quoting Midrash, that Yaakov observed 613 commandments, perhaps he did not observe physically 613 commandments, but there's some concept here that we must understand about the totality of all the commandments, that indeed Yaakov, our forefather Jacob, was quite in line while by his father-in-law Lavan. And let's try to elaborate and try to understand this. You see, the great commentator Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachmanides, Ramban points out that it was impossible for our forefather Jacob to observe all of the 613 commandments while at the home of Lavan. The home of Lavan is outside the borders of the land of Israel. The idea that our forefathers observed commandments prior to the giving of the Torah at Sinai is only applicable vis-a-vis the part of life that our forefathers lived in the land of Israel. But while abroad, they did not fulfill the commandments of the Torah. And the proof is, at least one very startling proof, is the fact that at the home of Lavan, Yaakov is married to two sisters, to Leah and Rachel. And that in itself is a biblical prohibition. So you cannot say that Yaakov, our forefather, observed all of the 613 commandments when we have a striking example of a particular commandment that Yaakov was in clear violation. And Ramban goes on to tell us that when Yaakov, our forefather, returns to the land of Canaan, Rachel dies so that Yaakov will remain married only to one of the two sisters, and as it had, providence was that Rachel would die and Yaakov would remain married to Leah, and to Leah only, one wife, in this case, of the two of Yaakov, of Rachel and Leah. So, it seems that 613 is somewhat problematic to assign that number to the amount of commandments, the numerical amount of commandments that were perhaps followed by and observed by our forefather Yaakov. Furthermore, when one considers the list of the 613 mitzvot, commandments, it becomes readily evident that it is impossible for one Jew to observe all of the 613 commandments. God never had this in mind, that a particular individual would observe 613. And I'll explain why. Number one, it is impossible to simultaneously be a man and a woman, simultaneously be a Kohen and not a Kohen, a Levi and not a Levi, someone who's a Yisrael, but he's not going to be Kohen or Levi, or perhaps a Kohen Gadol, the high priest, and not from the ordinary priests. And that person would also have to be a prophet, and also have to be a member of the high court, the Sanhedrin, and also the president of the Sanhedrin, the Nasi, and also a king, and also in the conditions, upon the conditions that the majority of the Jewish people reside in the land of Israel, and that the temple, the Beit HaMikdash, is up and running and functioning properly. The possibilities here are so awesome that a human being, one human being, would be obligated in so many of the 613, it is impossible that he or she would be involved in all of the 613. An absolute halachic impossibility. Furthermore, there are certain commandments as part of the 613 that I dare say, without even being a prophet, that God would be very, very, very happy and would welcome the opportunity that no Jew would ever have to fulfill these commandments. How could that be? We sometimes think in terms of the word mitzvah, commandment. We say in Hebrew mitzvah. We mean a good deed. So obviously every mitzvah, every commandment, we should have the opportunity of fulfilling, and we should fulfill such commandments. Why not? The only problem is that the word mitzvah doesn't mean a good deed. It means a divine command. And we find in the Torah that God commanded us to certain procedures. Some of those procedures, many, if not most of the Jewish people never ever fulfill, and rightfully so. So I'll give you just a few examples so we understand this. Number one, there is a whole section of the Torah revolving around the laws of divorce. Divorce. Now, it's true that marriage is a very, very important institution in Jewish life for purpose of continuity of the people. Yet, there are circumstances that dictate that the covenant of marriage must be broken. And when that happens, there is a procedure that the Torah delineates how to break up a marriage. The laws of divorce are counted as part of the 613 commandments. Now, can you just imagine if in every single household of the Jewish people there was absolute peace and harmony, shlom bayit, going on day in and day out, and there would be no need whatsoever for any couple to break up? Would God be angry at the people that no one is fulfilling the commandment of gerushin, of divorcing one's spouse? Obviously not. There's a whole section in the Torah that deals with damages. How do we deal with damages? How do we deal with false testimony? How do we deal with bad neighborly relationships? There are so many laws that deal with these interpersonal relationships when things break down. And each and every one are counted as commandments because they are procedures of how we are to deal with these given situations. Now, can you imagine a scenario where every single Jew behaves himself, behaves herself in a proper manner? Society is functioning beautifully. Nobody is having an argument or rift with the neighbor. Nobody is causing damage one to the other. Nobody is hurting the next person. There will be no need to activate any of these commandments of the laws of damage and of the breakdown of interpersonal relationships. Would God be angry? Of course not. Of course not. And therefore, you see that there are many of the 613 commandments that we are to perform them only in the event that things break down. And then we have no other recourse, we have no other choice. But we have to turn to these laws in order to guide us and dictate to us how to proceed, how to repair the damage. But if there would be no damage at all, then no one would be asked to be held accountable for not performing these commandments. Perhaps one last example, the laws of warfare. Yes, the Torah speaks of various laws of how the Jewish soldier is supposed to act in the line of duty. We have a famous saying from the prophet Isaiah, Lo yisagoy al goy cherev velo yilmedu od milchama. In the second chapter of Isaiah, and repeated by his student Micha in the 4th chapter, that nation shall not lift sword against nation, nor shall there be war anymore. It is such a famous, internationally widespread known saying that it's plastered on the walls of the United Nations in New York City. Lo yisagoy el goy cherev velo yilmedu od milchama. Can you imagine if we attain that moment of international bliss where no country would have to not only engage in warfare with another country, but there would be no need for military readiness? V'lo yilmedu od milchama. That will be a great day. And indeed, Isaiah the prophet is speaking about messianic days. For unfortunately, we're not there yet. But when that great day arrives, at that point, we won't have to activate those laws any longer. And therefore the question is, how is it that Yaakov, Jacob, our forefather, is observing 613 commandments at the home of his father-in-law Lavan? I believe the answer has to do with the fact that Taryag 613 is not necessarily a numerical component, but rather it represents the totality of everything a human being or a Jewish person is obligated to do. To that person, whatever the sum total may be, it's his version of 613. For many, it could only be 250 or 300 or 350 or perhaps even just 50. Whatever it turns out, as long as you're performing the maximum and being careful not to violate the maximum amount of transgressions and sins, you are within the framework of your personalized Taryag 613. And to that end, I believe we can understand what our sages in the Midrash were saying about our forefather Jacob, Yaakov Avinu. That in spite of the fact that there were so many things going against him at his father-in-law's house, nevertheless, he maintained his connection to all those commitments that he observed, that he received by transmission from his father Isaac, from his grandfather Abraham, and to Yaakov, to Jacob. This was considered his 613. What we're going to do in this series is take a look at as many as possible of the 613 so that we get not only a glimpse of the procedures, of the commandment, of how to do or what not to do, but more so, why we are doing something, why we are not doing something, the world of the rationale of mitzvah, ta'amei mitzvot, and to this end, the author of the Sefer HaChinuch has made an indelible mark on the history of Torah scholarship. Thank you.